If you're a lettriste poet, you argue that the letter is in fact the minimal unit of composition. But if you're a Derridian philosopher, it's the actual pen stroke or mark. If you have the misfortune of being a follower of Lyotard, it's the phrase. If you are a Saussurean, it's the word. If you are Ron Sullivan, you argue on behalf of the sentence. If you're Charles Olson, it's the syllable. If you're Mallarmé, it's the book. I mean, people begin to make these arguments about what constitutes the minimal unit of composition. And I would suggest that among our coterie of friends, the minimal unit of composition is in fact the database, the library itself. Kenny's practice is based almost entirely upon stealing entire libraries of material, and then republishing it under a new rubric, an aesthetic rubric. It's, I think, the first occasion in the history of literature where it's possible to imagine using that as the minimal unit of composition, because of course we have access to digital databases that are as simple to copy as any cut and paste command.
Well, also, in art world terminology, I mean, I think the methodology of appropriation was always object-based,
Mm-hmm.
One object-based. And now, on a work of mine like Uberweb, I'm appropriating entire oeuvres of people's output. So it is, the whole thing is just, scaled up. And I think like kind of what happens, why we become friends, and we're really very different poets, as you can hear. Where we meet is this moment in the late 90s where we start to feel the power and the pull of the web. And we realize that something big is coming. And we're not sure what it is, but we know that it's not going to be what it was. And I kind of feel that, like, as I go on, that the idea of postmodernism was merely, as many of us feel, was an extension of modernism, a last gasp of modernism. But the real break comes with the digital. And after the digital, everything changes. The whole world changes. I mean, it's a paradigm shift of such magnitude that I don't think we can begin to even theorize it in any way. The changes that have happened in our own lifetime here. As a matter of fact, the way that we can't remember the world before Facebook, or we can't remember the world before email, is a beautiful way of how we've integrated this into our lives. But I do think it's very poorly theorized. And I think a lot of people are doing a lot of things and they're not exactly theorizing why or how they're doing it. So when we meet, it's kind of like we're interested in encyclopedic projects. Christian at this time is working on Eunoia, reading the dictionary 7 times.
5 times.
Five times. I'm accumulating this vast amount of text. Darren Werschler, our friend, is making engines for art ideas that are exploding into text. Craig Dworkin is beginning to work on his book called Parse, where he parses Edward A. Abbott's book, How to Parse, from the 1890s according to his own method. And so we're doing all this kind of handwork because the technology is not quite there. And if you were to do Eunoia today, would
I would design a piece of software that would permit me to read through the dictionary several times, for sure. I mean, we met and decided that we should form a coterie of poets, in part because there was a series of convergent interests around the concept of writing. Brian Geisen, the great Canadian artist who was a member of the Beat movement and the inventor of the Dream Machine, joked that poetry is now 50 years behind painting, that poetry movements tend to follow in the wake of artistic movements with a very large lag time, and that in some sense our own practice is heavily informed by the artistic precedent set in the late 60s and early 70s by conceptual art. Except that it's reframed within the context of computerized digital technology. We met and we discovered that we had a set of convergent interests around 4 valences, 4 concepts of writing that constitute limit cases of expression that are very difficult, I think, for poets or other writers to consider legitimate. Among them being the model of plagiarism, the plagiarized text. Which Kenny has so excessively demonstrated as a potential fecund area of literary expertise. I mean, to his absolute discredit, he has never been accused of plagiarism, despite having stolen entire books of material and then republished them. I mean, this is a person who's celebrated for having read traffic reports to the President of the United States, right? All right. This is quite an extreme case of plagiarism that he's able to get away with, to the degree which others are unable to get away with. We recognize too that limit cases of procedurality in writing, suspending egoistic expression on behalf of some sort of algorithmic procedure for the production of a work, were difficult to absorb, and we began to experiment with very rigorous and extreme, if not Herculean, constraints, for which, of course, something like a plagiaristic text might be exemplary. Our friends began to explore limit cases of legibility, trying to produce completely illegible works. Kenny has currently prided himself on being a completely unreadable writer. The books he produces are not intended to be read. They are too thick, too arduous to actually read. He suggests that he'd prefer not to have a readership if he can have a thinkership. And I suppose that's where we, saw the concept of writing as being so significant. It's better to have a thinkership than a readership. It's better to be Tolstoy than J.K. Rowling's in that sense. And finally, if you would finish up by saying that delegating all of these tasks, all of which are somewhat inhuman, to an actual inhuman agency, like let the robots do it for us, right? Get the machines involved has been an important component of the practice. So, I've got friends who. We appreciate not so much for the quality of the poems that they themselves write, but for the quality of the programs that they design to write poetry on their behalf.
Like this. Ooh, sorry. I'm sorry. I think this thing was like banging. I can't do this thing. I'm sorry. Okay, like this poem. Like this poem is a remarkable feat of engineering. It doesn't look like much, does it?
It doesn't look like much. I apologize for that.
No. It's not. In a weird way, it's a remarkable poem, but not because of the words you see. But it's a remarkable poem because of the program necessary to make this thing happen.
Sure. I'm currently working on a project that requires me to write 2 poems that are written according to a very rigorous constraint that I thought would be relatively straightforward to fulfill. At the top of the screen here, you see an alphabet and what I call a xenocode. This is, in fact, a method of encipherment. I've actually paired off letters of the alphabet so that they're mutually encoded. So I've assigned the letters A to T. Wherever you might see the letter A and T, you'll see T assigned to A. A and T are assigned to each other, so is T and A are assigned to each other. Likewise, N and H are assigned to each other, just as H and N are assigned to each other. The letters are mutually correlated with each other. Apparently, there are a little less than 8 trillion different ways of mutually enciphering the alphabet, so the letters are correlated in this manner. And I thought about trying to write a poem such that you would pick one of those 8 trillion ciphers, write a poem that makes sense, is very beautiful. But if you swapped out all the letters from that poem and replaced them with their cognate in your code, you'd produce a new poem that still makes sense and still just as beautiful. So the uncanny thing about this particular poem is that wherever you might see an A in one poem, you'll see a T in the other, and vice versa. Wherever the word any appears in one poem, you'll see the in the other, and vice versa. The 2 poems are mutually transposable letter by letter. And the reason the poem is written according to this bizarre constraint is the poem on the left is intended to be enciphered as a genetic sequence and implanted into the genome of a microbe, replacing part of its genetic code so that the organism, in fact, embodies this poem in its actual living being. And the second poem is, in fact, the work that it writes in response by reading that genetic sequence and building a protein which enciphers this particular poem on the right. And these 2 poems, I think, are in dialogue with each other. The one on the left is obviously a very masculine assertion about the creation of life, whereas the poem on the right is, in fact, a much more feminine poem about refuting that, about the woebegone absence of life. It's kind of like 2 elegiac pastoral poems, one by the shepherd and one by the nymphette, in which they argue about the relative merits of their mutual seduction.
And I transcribe radio reports.
He transcribes radio reports. I had to design a piece of software to do this poem. And what's bizarre about this particular poem for me, and it may not be for you, but is that there are 8 trillion different possibilities at my disposal, none of which can produce a poem. That there's 8 trillion potential universes where you might imagine writing poetry according to such a constraint. And they do not generate living things. There are no poems out there in those worlds. And I was lucky enough to find the one universe out of 8 trillion where it's possible to write 2 poems in dialogue with each other. This work is actually on display now at the power plant. I can show you a picture, if you like, of the actual protein that the organism writes in response. This is the actual backbone of the protein that's generated by the microbe. This is its actual atomic structure. The punchline to this project is that the chosen host for the poetry is an unkillable bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans, capable of surviving in all kinds of hostile environments. You can scorch it, wither it, freeze it, and it continues to live. It can survive in the open vacuum of outer space. It can repair its own DNA so quickly that it does not evolve. It's a kind of evolutionary dead end. And it can even survive in an environment so radioactive that it can withstand 1,000 times the dosage of gamma rays that would instantly kill a human being. It's widely regarded as the most indestructible thing on the planet. And some scientists have speculated that it must have spent at least part of its evolutionary history in outer space. And by putting a poem inside this microbe, I would effectively be writing a book that could conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization, might be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. This is a limit case of writing, right? This is an absolutely deranged, completely impossible thing to try to do, right? Right? This is like, trying to, blow people's minds by showcasing what it is possible to do when you push writing to the absolute limit cases of its legitimacy and its feasibility. It still blows my mind that Kenny can, for example, publish a single edition of the Sunday Times in its entirety as a 600-page book. Every single piece of text, right down to the text on the vodka bottles, on the labels in the ads, the license plates on the cars, in the auto ads, the stock quotes, the page numbers. All of that can be actually released as a 600-page book and then be reviewed by the New York Times. Right?
It took a long time for them to take it seriously. I think when I first published the book, I sent it to them, and they picked up this thing. By the way, it's 900 pages.
900 pages, excuse me, right?
And they picked up this thing and said, "What the fuck is this?" and threw it into the slush pile. I always thought, I want to get sued because it's the only way to get famous. And I've tried to get sued many times, and they won't sue me. Probably because they just think this is weird shit. I did a book called Sports, right, which is a transcription of a Yankees-Red Sox game. And the book begins by stating in the very first paragraph, because it's the beginning of the broadcast, that this broadcast is property of the New York Yankees and may not be reproduced or broadcast in any other form without express written consent of the New York Yankees, right? And so I sent a copy to George Steinbrenner, hoping 2 things would happen. Either I would get sued and I get very famous, or he would buy the rights to the book, because of course the Yankees beat the Red Sox, and that would be a giveaway, at the gate once a year when the Red Sox are in town. He'd pay me for 50,000 copies to give out. Neither of those things happened. I've been running UberWeb for 18 years. It's a completely pirated site. I never ask for permission. I don't touch money. I don't take money. But I've never even come close to being sued for that kind of thing. Now I just kind of think that what I'm dealing with is marginal shit. There's no economic value to anything on UberWeb. There's no economic value to the work that I do. And I have this theory about copyright that people will come after you if it's worth their while coming after you. And if not, they're going to leave you alone. Do you know that Christian Bök has not cleared a single minute of the 24 hours of the clock? He has not cleared the right, with Marilyn Monroe and Jimmy Stewart and everybody else in that masterwork of his. And what Markley says, if I treat the work with respect and I don't denigrate it in any way, people seem to be okay with me using it. Right? This is an amazing thing. And he sold that edition of the clock many times over for $500,000. So, my argument about money may not be true. I can't quite figure out the conundrum of Markley, how he gets away with it. Or same with Girl Talk, who sells, you know, millions of copies, and everybody knows exactly what samples he's using, and nobody ever sues him. So this idea of copyright, UberWeb, and in my own work, which I don't copyright, my publishers often make me copyright it, but I personally say no copyright on it, and I give it all away anyway because I make no money from it.
If you'd like to read his work, you can find it online for free.
Yeah, of course.
It's all available, downloadable for free.
I mean, money. You know, I published a book with Coach House here a couple of years ago, and I got a royalty check, this spring for $23.17, and that's in Canadian dollars. So, take it. It's yours. So I think like UberWeb is this kind of utopia that assumes that I just say copyright, what's that? Never heard of it, doesn't exist. And everybody goes, yeah, copyright doesn't exist, go ahead, take it. But there's strange things that happen because the whole thing's inverted. On UberWeb, say, we've got the electronic music of this guy, this guy named Jean Dubuffet, right? And he makes this kind of incredible outsider, like music brute, great stuff from the 1960s, crazy, crazy stuff. And people come to UberWeb and they download that stuff, and later they find out that this guy also makes paintings, right? So it's this kind of crazy inversion of value. Of course, we couldn't have, you know, if I put you know, Lady Gaga up on Ubu, there people would come after me immediately, and they should, because if I had something that was worth millions of dollars, I'd probably want to protect it as well. So the stuff that's on UberWeb is the music of Marcel Duchamp. Oh, we have some pretty bad stuff too. In between the time Julian Schnabel was transitioning from a good painter to a great filmmaker, he decided to make a country music record. And that's up on UberWeb. Probably much to his embarrassment. So should we have some questions and
yes, possibly.
move
I think
on as it time?
If you'd like, yes.
Is it time? Yeah, we have a question.
I just have two comments. It was great to hear you guys talk. The first one is Billy Wilder, when he was given an Academy Award for a Lifetime Achievement Award. He
Who is he?
Billy Wilder,
Who is
Some
he?
Like It Hot.
A what?
Some Like It Hot.
Billy Wilder.
The filmmaker.
I always thought it was Wilder. Is it Wilder?
Wilder.
Okay, good.
Pardon. He said he was worried about the data, the future of the media arts, saying a chip couldn't create a creative work like The Apartment, etc. And as well as in literary form, someone like David Foster Wallace in Infinite Jest, the great novel. I wonder what are your thoughts on both or either of those two things?
I'm enthusiastically endorsing the idea that robots will exceed our potential as creative personalities, that probably poets from my generation or younger are likely to have to address the first artificial intelligences within their lifetime, and will probably have to think about them as potential consumers of culture. That, you know, some poetry I'm going to have to write will be dedicated to, you know, the robot readers of the future. And in fact, I would like to be able to get on the ground floor of that, because there's not a lot of human readers of poetry, okay? And I bet that I can open up that new market if I got the robot readers right away, right? I find that very dismaying that people might say that, because we already have machines contributing to culture excessively. More than 50% of transmissions across the web are between machines, not between human beings. They are increasingly dominating the communication traffic online. There is already at Amazon a machine that autonomously writes books and sells them that more than 200,000 books on Amazon are actually written entirely by computer for sale. Now, I, for one, welcome our robot overlords because I think it would be great to have a machine write all my books for me and I collect the royalties. I mean, I just think that would be great if I simply came up with a great idea.
You can have my royalties, too.
I mean, to have a golden goose that would lay the eggs for you, right? I think it would be fabulous. And already, you know, our friends are writing machines that are specifically designed to write poetry. And when people argue about the poor merits of machines, I always point to the very first book of poetry written by a computer back in the 1980s, a work called The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, which you can find as a PDF, stolen and pirated by Kenny on UbuWeb. It's a great book, published by the computer program Racter, R-A-C-T-E-R. And it has this lovely poem in the middle of it, which simply goes, Bill sings to Sarah, Sarah sings to Bill. Perhaps they will do other dangerous things together. They have love, but they also have typewriters. That is interesting. It's pretty good, I'd say.
If I could address the Foster Wallace and Billy Wilder side of things, you know, Markley often said that he could have crowdsourced the clock very, very quickly on the web. And what makes the clock so Markleyan and such a masterwork is the human intervention in putting it together, the massaging of the music in only ways that Christian Markley can do that. And I think that the crowdsourcing of the clock would create a different and probably more radical aesthetic than what Markley did. It would be jagged, it would be quick, it would be messy, sort of like those, what's that wonderful crowdsourced frame-by-frame Star Wars, scene-by-scene
that's
Star
a lovely
Wars
product,
people. Yeah. Can you describe that? Maybe I don't know that.
People across the web were permitted to refilm a 10-second interval from Star Wars in whatever medium or métier that they might like. So you get to reenact 10 seconds of the movie. And then those would be submitted collectively and restitched or edited together into the full movie. So you end up watching this absolutely bizarre concatenation of hand-drawn animation and badly acted backdoor, recreations of these scenes. You know, that's an amazing homage by beautiful fans. It's actually kind of beautiful.
And a computer really couldn't do that.
Not
so
yet.
We have this strange moment of human intervention, massaging technology to create something that is computer enabled and yet very hybrid. I mean, my work is so low tech, you know. I mean, I could have done that listening to a cassette tape of something and on a typewriter. It really wasn't contingent upon grabbing an MP3 from the web and putting it into Microsoft Word. I mean, I really don't use technology in that way. So I think there's a sort of, and I also have to say, Christian, that the thing that you're missing with your Brave New World is AR and Google Glass, which actually brings the human smack into the equation. That Google Glass and wearable computing doesn't happen without the human, and the sort of life stream begins now with Google Glass 24/7, which is uploading more every second of content, you know, in this sort of very extreme way. This is something that computers really, you know, are not yet doing. So I think it's better. You know, we used to think about these sealed off hybrid worlds. I'm sorry, these sealed off worlds like Second Life or virtual reality as being, you know, VR as being the kind of thing for the future. And now with augmented reality and wearable computing, we're actually bringing it back down to the local and bringing it back onto the back into the human, which, you know, nobody. I think Second Life is pretty quiet these days.
Are there people on Second Life out there?
Yes, there are. I'm joking a little about that. So, okay, any other questions?
Please don't be shy. We're welcome to be subjected to your inquisition.
No.
I was at a poetry reading launch for the Spring List for Book Thug, and a translator said, after postmodernism, modernism. And I'm wondering what your take is on traditions of the modern.
The problem with
Specifically, I'm thinking of mid-20th century. Like you mentioned Geisen, so the mid-20th century, and things like Castellanos, assembling, that kind of thing.
I think the problem with that assumption that the future is a reversion to the past ignores the fact that we are really immersed in a completely different technological milieu. And it's not just the web that alters that world. For example, a work like the one you see over my shoulder here is incapable of existing in the modernist milieu. It's a product of a 21st century sensibility and technology. My feeling is that poetry has to respond conceptually and very acutely to the actual sociological and technological circumstances of its day. Modernism does not exist with the personal computer. It does not exist with genetic engineering. It does not exist with the threat of nuclear holocaust or climate change. So the consequences of the aesthetic dimensions of our life are radically different. If modernism were somehow to reassert itself, it would not even remotely look, I think, like anything that prevailed in the early 20th century. I mean, I could joke, for example, that Kenny might appear to be a Joycean figure, if only because he has, for example, recorded his speech for 1 week and then exhibited it at the art gallery. He's published it as a book, showcasing the quotidian language of everyday life, something that, oddly enough, no artist had thought to do before. And the weird thing about it, of course, is that it showcases the poetic dimensions of everyday discursive cadences, and it gives the lie to those poets who say, I'm a confessional poet, everything I do and say is in fact open to public examination. It gives the lie to those poets who say, I write without editing, it's first thought, best thought. Or those poets who say, I speak in the everyday language of the street. And these kinds of works showcase that those claims are not based on real evidence. Here you actually have real evidence. I mean, in some sense, this constitutes a precursor to the idea of the Google Glass recording everything that we might witness. Kenny actually spent a week indulging in an analog version of that, recording everything that he said, and then proceeding to transcribe it, belaboring the act of actually reciting everything that he...
It's a terrible thing.
It is a terrible thing.
It's a horrible book.
I mean, the thing is, imagine you own everything that you say. In a day in which we're supposed to be worried about our own copyright, we of course know that we say things and write things that we would otherwise disown, right? All of the insults against our friends behind their backs, all the secrets that we promise to keep but then divulge, all the things we say about our boss, right, to our friends, our sexual banter, right, with our lovers,
my wife into having
all
sex
that stuff
on a
is
Wednesday night.
Up there on the wall. Okay, he lost so many friends as a side effect of this thing, right? I'm so glad I didn't know him when he was doing it, right? I mean, Kenny, Kenny, as you might imagine, is a somewhat roguish personality, and a gossip and a wit. I mean, you read the book, and he's at an art opening, and you know he's talking to somebody really powerful and important. He's going, yeah, I saw that show. That's brilliant. Really, you sold it for that much? That's amazing. That's incredible. Really? Wow, you're such a genius. That's incredible. That's incredible. What a fucking asshole.
When I get home, when I get home,
the interval when he gets home,
that guy's insufferable.
There's no break, right? It's just all of a sudden the compliments are finished, and then it's and then he's dishing on the person after they walk away. And of course that's on the wall right there for public inspection. I'm pretty sure that people who actually went to that gallery show probably went to find their own name.
Well, if you've ever been in a newspaper, and there's a giant chunk of text, and you're looking for your name, you find it immediately. It jumps right out at you. So people would come in and find their names. But if I could address the modernist question too, I mean, I think that there are parts of the world that have completely forgotten modernism existed and are not interested in modernism. I'm speaking specifically about some places in Asia. When I look at the new art coming out of China, all of it which is organic and figurative and metaphorical, mythological, I see no traces of Duchamp in that work whatsoever, which says to me that the memory of modernism was so stamped out in the Cultural Revolution that for all intents and purposes, vanished. I was in China talking about conceptual writing, and I gave a reading or a lecture, and a woman put her hand up, and the first question I was asked was, "But Professor Goldsmith, how does your work relate to Longfellow?" Right? And I thought, Longfellow. So I feel that if I look at a lot of design that's coming from say Korea, it's nature-based. It's not gridded at all. I don't see Corbusier, I don't see Duchamp, I don't see the Bauhaus, I don't see all of the stuff that I look for, and therefore my Western sensibility looks at that and says, that's bad design. Now I have to adjust my sense of what good design is, because I clearly think that there's a whole section of the world for whom modernism means very little. And it's my problem to adjust to. Not certainly, they're not missing anything really.
Okay, we got a gentleman over here.
Okay, this is a two-part question for Christian. How does your conceptual appropriation differ from the quoting style used by such poets as P.K. Page, popularized by people like her? Is it the interface with computers? Is that the difference?
I would suggest that the difference is based on scale. I mean, every poet probably throughout history has stolen material from other poets, right? Here it's the bravado and temerity of the theft. I mean, if you go in and scoop up the entirety of the 20th century avant-garde and sign off on it, as Kenny has done, if you steal, an entire year's worth of weather reports, right, and then publish it as a book. I mean, this is unprecedented, at least in the milieu of literature. These kinds of thefts in the world of art are probably standardized now and normalized, but for whatever reason,
old-fashioned.
They seem old-fashioned. In fact, they seem somewhat dated.
The art world dealt with these issues 100 years ago with Duchamp. It was finished. People would these moves that we think are so radical in writing are 30 years passé in visual art. They'd laugh at us, say, "Oh, we're appropriating." Oh, God. Somebody did that before. But also, I think that also to go back to this sense of Geisen too, is that in the 20th century, language was always stuck on a page. So that if I wanted to reproduce something, I'd still have language stuck onto a page. And the digital language is fluid and liquid. It can be spammed. It can be poured into any number of forms. It can be pushed down into music. It can be uploaded. It can be downloaded. It can be shaped. It can be, there's this kind of gorgeous plasticity that is predicted by the concrete poets. And if you look at mid-20th century practices, you actually see a lot of the theory coming true now in the digital age that was proposed by concrete poets and somebody like Geisen. The other thing was, why didn't appropriation, large-scale appropriation, has never happened in literature ever? And why is that? It's happening all over now. Because if you were to retype Ulysses, it would take forever. But Ulysses is all over the web, and in 3 keystrokes, I've got that thing in my clipboard. And now what am I going to do with it? Now, artists break things. Artists do things that they're not supposed to do. So cut and paste. This stupid thing that we don't even theorize and think about is this thing that people are exploiting for new literary practices. It doesn't look like literature, but you have that famous quote from Truman Capote upon seeing On the Road. He says, "That's not writing, that's typing." So, of course, things don't appear to be writing what are writing. Is that writing? That's not writing, that's science. I would hear people say.
You had a second part to your question.
I was wondering if you said your sources are promiscuous. Do you work from a journal?
I'm sorry, do what?
You work from a journal notes.
Oh, I do keep a notebook at hand, but all my notes are actually stored digitally. Certainly, I would write down things that occur to me so that I won't, in fact, forget them. And Kenny is always encouraging me to try and simply publish the, accumulated notes, the jottings themselves, without any, any expurgation. They're carefully sorted into, topical categories. This kind of aesthetic sensibility arises, I think, from deep obsessive-compulsive disorders, really. That there's a certain kind of autism required to be able to do it, okay? And to appreciate it, likewise, as I said. I mean, I've read Soliloquy. I've actually had to read it a few times, and it's a very long book. And, there's not a lot that happens, right, in it. It's kind of like the reality TV version of literature, right? If you could imagine that.
Except reality TV would have cut out all the boring parts.
Right, yeah.
So it would have reduced it down to 2 pages. Just
something like that.
The sex scenes.
So, yeah.
2 pages. Page and a half.
Yes, in some sense, the Google search engine constitutes your great Swiss Army knife for composition, right? I mean, is it necessary to keep even journal notes if all I have to do is, in fact, type in a few keywords to extract the entire rich fund of material for a work of art? And one of our kind of fellow travelers, counterparts to our practice, composes poetry by simply inputting oddball search strings into Google and then collating the resultant output, turning that into deliberately outlandish poetry. And of course, it's very successful.
Or flarf.
Yeah,
I mean, flarf, all of that.
It's successful in part because it's so surprising, and it couldn't exist easily without the invention of the web and these tools that make it possible to write accordingly. Being a poet is I think, a challenging profession because it rates very low on the cultural totem pole. It's way below organ-grinding monkey. It's certainly, there's, between poet and playwright, there's an enormous gulf of Elvis impersonators and contortionists and, link boys, people, like completely outdated professions that you would rather pay to see, right? If we had $5 to go see the monkey play drums or us perform, I think you'd go see the monkey, right?
Can I cut you off and quote you? This is one of my favorite quotes from Christian. He says, "I always joke with my students that poetry couldn't possibly be as hard as they think it is, because if it were as hard as they thought it was, poets wouldn't do it. Really, they're the laziest, stupidest people I know. They became poets in part because they were demoted to that job. You should never tell your students to write what they know because, of course, they know nothing. They're poets. If they knew something, they'd be in that discipline actually doing it. They'd be in history or physics or math or business or whatever it is where they could excel." Should we take one more question and call it a night? One more question? 2 more? And that's it, yeah. Okay, 2 more and we'll
3 more? Do 3 more. Sure, yeah. Sorry. As long as we're going to time it.
Let's keep our answers a little short.
Okay, I apologize for our long-windedness.
We're boring you. Okay, in that section.
This question's good timing here. Despite the very different ways in which you write, humor seems to play an extraordinary part. Can you talk seriously about humor in your work?
Poets from our generation are responding in part to the deep seriousness of the experimental poets from the last generation. The language poets were on many occasions very sober in their experimentalism. I used to joke, I think, that the avant-garde has suffered from a lethal dose of seriousness for the last 30 years or so. And I think that somebody as witty as Kenny really is incapable of being serious. I have to admit that I've not really seen him spend more than 10 minutes at a go being serious without cracking a joke at my expense or doing something impish and mischievous. I think that humor is a way for others to find access to work that might otherwise be too obdurate or hermetic to understand. Everything that we've done here for you today is in fact perfectly understandable, fully integratable, and yet is nevertheless a work of experimental practice. Whereas before, it was necessary and incumbent upon the poet to actually be deliberately difficult in order to practice avant-garde literature. And I think that there's a turn of fortune here towards a model of accessibility that is even more deranged, that feels stranger to audiences. And yet, by virtue of its wit or its lightheartedness, is something that broaches accessibility.
Great. I have nothing to add to that. Another question?
That was my serious answer, and I apologize. I try to crack a joke every 30 seconds, and I'm really failing.
Do you find that the poem or the artwork can be the reaction of the people that are reading it or looking at it or hearing it? Do you think that's
sure. Oh, sure. I mean,
that sometimes it overpowers it sometimes?
No, I mean, this is part deliberate, and I'll let Kenny elaborate in some detail, but Kenny has asked the Planet to print out the internet for him. He's trying to crowdsource the complete printout of the internet as an art project. What's the deadline for that?
Soon.
Soon.
I better get to work.
It's like July, mid-July, end of July. He'd like to have the entire internet printed out.
And delivered to Mexico City.
They've already got quite a lot of material so far, right? There is a petition to prevent him from printing out the internet for fear that this will cause a great arboreal holocaust.
There's 10 billion pages of internet. There's 6 billion people on the earth. If everybody prints out 2, we're going to get the job done.
You're going to get the job done?
And have a little extra.
I mean, really, I want to see the internet printed out so I can scan it right back in. I mean,
But I think to Christian's point is, no matter what shows up in that gallery in Mexico, it's been successful because the conversation, the worldwide outrage, and what it's really the conversation around it has made this a great success. And I think it'd be really funny if a couple of envelopes show up in the gallery in Mexico, and I put them in a box and put in the middle of the gallery and write the internet on it. I mean, it doesn't really matter. So I think, my texts are really impossible to read. I fall asleep repeatedly when I have to proofread them. Forget it. I can't stand my own books. But they're really fun to talk about and bounce around a little bit. And they're fun to read at a short stretch. Anything, the voice hydrates the driest of texts. So anything for a little while read by the human voice can actually make it bearable. But I don't recommend going on too long. I think there was another thing about our predecessors. Language poets were up there to bore the shit out of you. That was cool to make. That was another mid-century 20th avant-garde thing, to clear the room. Hey man, we did a good job. We cleared the room. We're glad to see that one go. So I mean, Christians are. We're into performing actually. And the great performers I consider to be the slam poets. I don't like what they have to say. I can't stand it, but I love the way that they do it. I find it embarrassing to sit through that stuff, but I do love the way that they do it. I find that they have basically the right idea. They can keep an audience in the room. You have that, that right idea. So that's something else that's also changed. How about one more question?
It's a bit of a two-part, I think. It could be, you can keep it short if you want. What seems both your practices kind of use aggregation, manipulation, and dissemination as, part of your methodology. The first part would be, how open are you to kind of see that work go out and then be open and vulnerable to the same cycle by another person, to be your work being aggregated and manipulated and disseminated in another form. And the second part would be a lot of the work that you both have spoken about seems project-based. I wonder what stays within the studio and how you would describe work that does not become a book or ends up in a gallery.
Yeah. I think that, well, I don't know. Why don't you? I'm working on something here.
If you're arguing on behalf of the virtues of thievery and piracy it seems hypocritical then to suggest that others cannot use what you've made. Oh, I sure as hell hope that my work gets pirated. Whenever Unoya appears on a BitTorrent, I am thrilled. I promptly tweet, "Go find it. Download it while you can," because I'm now going to have to send out a takedown notice, on behalf of the publisher, right? But act now while you still can.
You
because,
do? You have to send out a takedown
takedown. Yeah, they have to
notice?
send out a takedown notice. I mean,
Really? Why?
I don't to maintain appearances. I don't want to put my publisher out of business, right? I like them, but I make sure that the work is disseminated. In part because I think the more people who are exposed to the work in whatever form it might be, whether it be in a bowdlerized form as it's manipulated, every artist wants to influence others and be the material for future artworks. I'm thrilled when people show up saying, "I just made something out of your book. I did something else in response to it, good or bad." I'm always thrilled because it suggests that I was influential. I did something right. I changed their lives so that they wanted to run away and join the circus. They did something cool in response.
If your work is actually being pirated, that is a sign that you've made it as an artist, right? That's a sign of success. I think that's a huge honor. If your work is pirated, most of us would dream of having our work pirated.
Now, there are some poets who are very upset when their work gets pirated because they feel like they're losing income. They're losing that $21.63, right? And most of us, in fact, don't make the lion's share of our income from the publication of the books. I do make some royalties that are, I think, by most poetic standards, pretty excellent. But most of the money I make is, in fact, by providing tech support. Right? You don't know how to operate this poem? I will show you how. I will come to your home and plug it in for you, and I'll set it up, okay? Get it all installed, right? Trick out the whole house with a beautiful security system, right? So your poems are really, you can enjoy them in the comfort of your own home, okay? Right? It's challenging to get them, right? Tech support is really what we do. I mean, doing stuff like this, right? This is all tech support, right? You're coming out, I think, to have the privilege, right, of meeting me and Kenny in person, right? Because it's hard for people to do that, right? En masse, right? It's challenging to be able to get drunk with me in a bar, in a crowd of more than a few dozen people, right? So
you're all welcome to join us.
You're all welcome to join us afterwards, right? So I think that's what's at stake is that making sure that you actually have an influence upon the practice of others. So I'm actually quite thrilled when people bowdlerize the work, challenge it, so long as my work is out there unexpurgated, competing in the marketplace. If it's actually out there itself, I would feel very disappointed if my book wasn't out there and only the bowdlerized editions or the alterations or the messed up versions of it were out there. I'd feel unhappy about that. But so long as the thing I made is actually represented and asserted, I think it's okay.
I'm interested in the misuse. Mm-hmm. On Ubu, it's sort of great. Most of us, us in the room go to UbuWeb to worship the sounds of the avant-garde, but most people don't care. For most people, this is a source of really weird sounds that they can mix into dance remixes. And so you have Paul Dutton being sampled and thrown into beats in a dance floor in Sao Paulo, beyond doo-wop, boom, 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 boom. This is the misuse of that material. I'm actually quite interested in the misuse. Creative Commons, not so good. Creative Commons is another form of copyright. I don't believe in copyright at all. I hate it. And I think Creative Commons is just more law set up by a lawyer.
Now, Kenny does also have a lot of material that ends up on the cutting room floor. You've also asked about the material that, in fact, does not participate within projects. Obviously, we both write things in the interstices of our own time that have nothing necessarily to do with what we're currently working on. And these are, I suppose, the fodder for future works, I suppose, right? The challenge of writing poetry is that there are more ideas than we have resources at our disposal to actually fulfill. It's a complete fecund, surfeit of ideas at our disposal. And I know that in the course of my lifetime, I'm not going to be able to realize all the possible books I might like to write. if only because those potential works are going to fall into abeyance, they're going to, languish because there are no resources to actually realize them. There's not enough time. At my present rate of production, my next book is going to be a few decades away. My first book took 4 years to write. My second took 7 years to write. I'm now in the 12th or 13th year of this project. That's not a good, logarithmic scale, right? Right.
Great way to end.
Yeah. Thank you. You've all been very patient with us. We appreciate it. Very cordial and gracious. Thank you so much for being so kind. Please join us at the bar, wherever it might be.